You have lived this before. A coworker you trusted said something they shouldn't have said, or the atmosphere suddenly changed after you shared something that seemed completely harmless. Or maybe you've had that vague feeling for a while that something doesn't quite add up between the warmth of the people around you and what actually happens when something is at stake. You weren't wrong. You were operating with incomplete information. And that mistake has a precise name: confusing repeated proximity with real loyalty. That is the illusion. And it is so well built that most people don't see it until they've already paid the price for falling into it. There is a huge difference between feeling comfortable in a place and being safe in that place. And the corporate world is one of the spaces where those two things get confused most easily, most often, and with the most concrete consequences. Not because people are naturally disloyal, but because the system everyone is operating inside has its own logic. And that logic doesn't stop working just because you decided to trust someone. The precise name for that confusion is a contextual bond. It works as long as the context supports it. When the context changes, the bond reorganizes itself. It can be warm. It can even be genuine. What it usually isn't is unconditional. That is what nobody explains when you enter a company. The person you have lunch with every day at the office is not there because they chose you. They are there because they have their own reasons for staying there. And those reasons don't disappear just because there is sympathy between you. You spend more hours with your coworkers than with the people who have genuinely chosen you in life. That is not an exaggeration, it is simple arithmetic. And when you spend that much time with the same people, when you go through the same projects, the same difficult bosses, the same exhausting weeks, your brain confuses repetition with a real bond. It confuses shared history with mutual choice. It confuses friendship with convenience sustained over time. But your brain is reading the intensity of the exposure, not the nature of the bond. The reason your coworkers are still there is not loyalty to you. It is self-interest, stability, and professional survival. And when those reasons come into conflict with yours, theirs will almost always win. Not because they are bad people, but because that is how a system works when it rewards positioning, visibility, and convenience. Think about this. A role opens up. Just one. And the person you have coffee with every morning, the person you complain to about the same boss, the person you celebrate Fridays with, turns out to be the internal candidate with the best chance of getting that position. Until that Monday, everything felt like camaraderie. From that Monday on, the dynamic changed. Not because she consciously decided to change it, but because the system activated a logic that had always been there, underneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to appear. That is not betrayal, that is structure. And understanding that difference is what separates the person who operates with clarity from the person who is always caught by surprise. Loyalty at work exists, but it only lasts as long as interests don't collide. When they do collide, loyalty reorganizes itself. And that reorganization can happen in very concrete, very quiet ways. A professional with several years of experience once mentioned, in a conversation that felt completely private, that she was going through financial difficulties. She didn't say it in a meeting. She didn't post it anywhere. She told someone she trusted at the office, in that confidential tone that gets built after months of hallway conversations. 3 weeks later, that information had reached her manager. Not because her colleague was a bad person, but because at work, information always ends up moving toward wherever it becomes useful. And information about someone's vulnerability is always, in some way, useful to someone. But information doesn't only circulate about personal matters. It also circulates about professional ones. Some people make a casual comment about a coworker, a leadership decision, or a project that went badly with no intention of causing harm. It simply happens in the context of a conversation that felt safe. And then that comment resurfaces weeks later in a performance review meeting. Slightly transformed, stripped of its original context, but still perfectly recognizable. Because information at work always moves, and once it changes hands, it no longer belongs to you. The cost of that is not always immediately visible. Sometimes it shows up in a review you weren't expecting. Sometimes in an important project you are suddenly no longer part of. sometimes in a restructuring where the team gets reorganized and you end up in a more peripheral position than before, without anyone explaining exactly why. That is the quietest and most common way the system processes information that circulated without your control, not through open conflict, through a reorganization that looks normal and already carries your words inside it. Most workplace bonds do not survive the end of the context that sustained them. When someone changes teams, companies, or cities, the intensity of that relationship dissolves at a speed that can be surprising, not because anyone is to blame, but because what sustained that bond was the repetition of a shared space, not mutual choice. What looked like friendship was in reality shared convenience within a specific context. And while you are still inside that context, you need to see it clearly. Real friendships that survive that change do exist. They are the exception. The problem is not that they exist. The problem is treating them as if they are the rule while you still depend on that same environment to operate. Because while you depend on that environment, a contextual bond has conditions that are not always visible. And confusing those conditions with unconditional loyalty has a cost that usually shows up at the worst possible moment. If this analysis is putting a name to something you have already lived through, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. What we talk about here does not appear in any human resources manual. So what do you do with all of this? This is not about becoming closed off or treating your coworkers like enemies. It is not about building an artificial distance that makes your day-to-day life harder. It is about developing a very specific skill, being warm, present, and professionally pleasant without confusing that warmth with real intimacy. That distinction is not cold, it is precise. And in an environment where words circulate and dynamics change without warning, precision is a form of protection that doesn't require you to become someone else. There is a simple question you can ask yourself before sharing something at the office. If this information reaches my boss, or HR, or someone who does not wish me well, could it hurt me? If the answer is yes, or even maybe, that information does not belong in a work conversation. That includes your personal conflicts, your financial problems, your opinions about leadership, your ambitions, your frustrations. Not because you have something to hide, but because in an environment where information moves, controlling what you release about yourself is a basic form of professional intelligence. Also think about how you behave when someone starts speaking badly about a coworker. The person who listens doesn't feed the cycle, doesn't add their own version, and naturally changes the subject does not go unnoticed. They become reliable by default. And in practice, that means that when something important is at stake, people think twice before using them as a tool. Not because that person asked for that treatment, but because they built it, conversation by conversation, without making noise. And there is something else worth understanding about gossip. Not all corporate gossip is malicious, but all corporate gossip has the same effect. It positions you. The question is not whether gossip exists, because it always does. The question is whether the positioning it creates helps you or hurts you. When you are the one talking about other people, you are giving up control over how you are perceived. Because at work, talking about others always ends up positioning you. The person who understands all of this does not work with paranoia. They work with boundaries. They know what to share and what not to share. They know how to read when a conversation between work friends is genuine and when it is a conversation with consequences. They know when the system is activating its own logic underneath what looks like an ordinary interaction. And that reading does not make them cynical, it makes them free. Because real freedom inside a corporate environment does not come from trusting everyone. It comes from knowing exactly where the boundaries are and consciously deciding how to move within them. The people who understand this difference are not the coldest people in the room. They are usually the hardest to destabilize when the dynamic changes. They build solid professional relationships precisely because they do not ask those relationships to give what they cannot give. And paradoxically, they are also the ones with the greatest chance of something genuine emerging from those bonds when the context changes. Because they did not contaminate the relationship with expectations the system cannot sustain. You were not crazy. You were not weak. You were sitting in that meeting, hearing something come back in a way you did not expect. something you had said in private, in another form, in another tone, in someone else's mouth, and you did not understand exactly how it got there. Now you know. Closeness at work can be real, loyalty, not always. And confusing the two has a cost nobody explains to you before you pay it. If you want to keep understanding how the corporate world really works, what dynamics operate beneath the surface, and how to move through them with more clarity and less emotional cost, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. There is no empty motivation here, no generic advice, only what really happens, and how to read it before it affects you.